Thank you so much, Sonia, and I'm really pleased to be here. And I want to start briefly in a relational way by acknowledging that I'm joining you here today from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation in Alberta, Canada. I live here in Edmonton, which in Cree is a Amiskwichi Waskaikan or Beaver Hills House. And so welcome to all of you and from the various places that you are joining us from today. Our plan today for this session is that Dr. Lester will speak for 45 to 50 minutes or so, and we'll then open up to a Q&A. And when we go to Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A box there, and that's where we'll gather questions from. You're also welcome, if you're comfortable, to raise your hand, and we can have you unmute and speak if you'd like. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Nina Lester, who is from Indiana University Bloomington, a professor of qualitative methodology in the School of Education there. She takes a really interdisciplinary approach to her work, publishes in areas related to critical approaches to qualitative methodology, with a particular focus on discourse and conversation analysis methods, digital tools and spaces, and disability in critical qualitative inquiry, and has really sought to examine and illustrate how everyday and institutional language use makes visible what and who becomes positioned as normal and abnormal. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk, the title of which is the AI Renaissance and the Futures of Qualitative Inquiry. So welcome, Dr. Lester, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sara, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks to the conference organizers for putting together a fantastic gathering for all of us within the qualitative community. In my talk today, I hope to invite all of us as a community of qualitative inquirers to consider what has really become very much a central aspect of our everyday and professional lives as inquirers. Without a doubt, generative AI is no longer peripheral to our lives, and many would argue it's also no longer peripheral to our research practice. Rather, it is most certainly shaping the very terrain upon which our inquiry rests. And so as qualitative inquirers, we are really now working in landscapes where generative AI has become part of our lexicon, perhaps even part of our methodological practices. Without a doubt, Gen AI is part of our lives, whether we like it or not. It is increasingly embedded in known and unknown ways in society, as well as across organizational contexts and practices. Headlines, both in popular press and scholarly literature, have made quite clear that AI is our future. It's here to stay. It's bringing us new ways to work fast, some have argued. Some even say it will help us work better with greater efficiency, a type of efficiency that many have argued wasn't possible previously. And in qualitative inquiry, some have argued that it can become our co-thinker in a way, our co-researcher, perhaps even produce inquiry that is conceptualized as innovative, more innovative than it's ever been. The organizations we work for have also begun to tell us that we can now work better, faster, some even say smarter. As an example, perhaps we no longer need to read long texts in full. So for us as qualitative inquirers, the message has become increasingly quite clear. It's this idea that AI is inevitable and that it's inevitable in qualitative inquiry. So in this talk, I'm going to invite us to think within this particular framing, a framing that often has increasingly begun to emphasize inevitability. I suggest that as a community, it is important that we really wrestle with the assumption that increasingly organizes how AI is taken up in qualitative inquiry. And that is this assumption of inevitability. If we look towards popular culture, we see a similar logic quite common, woven throughout. As one example, in the film Avengers Endgame, for those that might be familiar, Thanos, one of the characters, has a line where he says, "I am inevitable." meaning that his victory and endgame of restructuring the universe is a given. It's presumably unavoidable, it's fate, it's taken for granted, no matter anyone's actions. In fact, what's the point of even acting or even thinking, as this is a given? So I've been really intrigued by this discourse of inevitability as it relates to qualitative inquiry and generative AI. As this discourse in other contexts we see is one that often functions to treat things as givens, to treat actions as depoliticized realities, simple descriptions of what is. So how are we to think about the idea that Gen AI is inevitable in qualitative inquiry? As I noted, inevitability broadly is often treated as a simple description. When we think about its place within technological change, we see this often oriented to as well as simply that which is. I want to suggest that it's important for us as qualitative inquirers to view the notion of inevitability as an epistemic claim, one that authorizes certain forms of knowledge and practice while potentially foreclosing others. From science and technology studies, as well as feminist perspectives, we know that technologies do not simply arrive. They are made no matter, they're made to matter through the narratives that we tell, through institutional arrangements, as well as within and through relations of power. So indeed, AI feels inevitable in qualitative inquiry, inevitable in our work lives, in the organizations within which we work. We are indeed surrounded by narratives of inevitability, and this language of inevitability does really important political work. It always already has the capacity to render contingent design choices, technological design choices, as natural facts, to recast ethical questions as problems of implementation, to shift responsibility away from collective deliberation and towards individual adaptation. Within qualitative inquiry, this framing increasingly positions Gen AI as an unavoidable extension of analytic practice rather than as a reconfiguration, perhaps even a contested reconfiguration of what it means to engage in analysis and interpretation. So my starting point today is an unsettling of that framing. Rather than asking whether AI can be useful for qualitative research, I'm interested in how AI's epistemic logics are already reshaping the foundational practices of qualitative inquiry, how they're reconfiguring relations between inquirers and participants, data and interpretation, between human and non-human actors. Gen AI is not a neutral tool. No digital tool or space is. It operates within inquiry, not at its margins. And it is actively involved in remaking what counts as knowledge, as well as what counts as responsible research and ethical relations. So what follows in my talk is not a roadmap for adoption, nor is it going to be me saying whether or not we should adopt or not adopt AI in our methodological practices. I also will not be outlining how you may or may not use Gen AI in your practice. Rather, I'm going to offer a series of reflexive questions intended to foreground the consequences, both good and bad, of these reconfigurations, particularly for qualitative inquiry's longstanding commitments to situated knowing, as well as relational ethics. And as Jasmine Ulmer reminds us, when we turn methodological traditions in qualitative inquiry, we should do this with care and thoughtfulness. She writes that methodological developments and growth happen when we allow scholarship, and I'll quote her here, to turn on its own merits versus assigning demerits to others. So indeed, Gen AI has introduced new methods, new ways of thinking about doing qualitative inquiry, as well as new ways of thinking about being a qualitative scholar. It is true that traditions, at least in some contexts, are indeed being turned. So I would suggest that to engage in this conversation today, we need to turn back before we turn forward, before we look towards our futures. So I want to start by delving into a very, very, very brief history of qualitative inquiry and its intersections with emergent technologies. Then I'll introduce the concept of technological reflexivity and a framework focused on consequences that my colleague Trina Paulus and I have been writing around and thinking about as we navigate ourselves this new landscape. Following this, I'll invite us to think with the reflexive questions within this framework as we consider both known and unknown consequences of Gen AI and qualitative inquiry. I want to forewarn you again that I'm not going to offer concrete answers to use or not to use. Rather, I'm inviting us to do what we do so well as a qualitative community, and that is to engage in recursive reflexivity. And my hope is that in engaging together around these ideas, we can think about how any turns in our methodological traditions might be done with care, as well as attunement to the known and unknown consequences. And I would also suggest, as well as engaging in a recognition that inevitability isn't the framing we should engage when making methodological choices. So let's delve in. So this moment that we are all living, one where really a new and emerging technological development is impacting the very doing of our practice as qualitative inquirers, is not necessarily new to us. We as qualitative inquirers have long had to respond to technological shifts and have recognized across time that these shifts indeed do intersect with the makings of methodology, with how we think about sense making and do sense making and world making. There have been many moments within the landscape and history of qualitative inquiry where we can track how our methodologies and our methods were remade, at least in part, in relation to technologies. So really, technologies and methodologies have always already intersected. And of course, methodological practices are themselves historical artifacts. They didn't just come to be, but rather emerge over time. And this is perhaps most obvious, at least it is to me, when we consider how transcription came on the scene for us as qualitative researchers. So just a historical example here. So prior to the advent of recording technologies, qualitative researchers relied on handwritten field notes and notes from interviews as their primary data sources. In the late 19th century, reproducible sound recordings then allowed qualitative researchers to generate data more quickly, and some might argue more comprehensively, although that's certainly debatable. Speed writing shifted to stenography, then that shifted to tape recording devices after World War II. And then there was a shift to recording devices eventually, and the developments that allowed for walk-along interviews, go-along interviews, and soundscapes, and so much more. I could go on and on. So early reliance on analog methods with no to little use of digital tools turned tape recorders introduced new modes of data collection in the 1960s. Then it turned to digital recording devices and computer advancements to the advent of the internet. And then within the qualitative community, we saw the emergence of qualitative data analysis software packages. 2002, the development of the first AI-supported qualitative data analysis package, which was called Qualtrics, 2002. This used computational techniques and case-based reasoning to suggest codes. So I think it's important to recognize that the idea that technologies, including AI, shape our methodological making and practicing is actually not new to our community. We have been engaging in this work again and again, and our histories, our responses really can inform our present orientation to this moment. Moreover, when thinking about innovation, we might perhaps want to look back rather than look forward alone. We can do both ends. Maisha Wen recently noted, and I'll quote her here, "We think about innovation as something that is ahead of us, something that has yet to be discovered, something that is inherently futuristic. Perhaps it's something that already is and always has been," meaning we can turn to our histories. So as I move now to introduce a reflexivity framework for supporting us as we engage with technologies such as Gen AI, I want to offer us an invitation to commit and perhaps even to refuse to only look forward, and rather might we turn to our histories to make sense of our next steps as a methodological community. So looking back to look forward, I want to be explicit also about my own assumptions. My methodological work focuses on everyday and institutional interactions. It's often at the intersections, as was noted, of critical qualitative inquiry and disability studies. And much of the data I work with is relational and it's sensitive data. I approach digital tools and spaces as consequential rather than neutral. Most certainly, they are capable of transforming and at times flattening qualitative practices. I also recognize that we are living in times where we are not simply using tools, but we're living through them, even if we're not aware that we are. So I have certainly experimented with Gen AI in a range of everyday life and academic tasks, and trying to remain attentive to how these tools circulate around me in known and unknown ways. At the same time, I have been hesitant, reluctant, even slow, you could say, to move quickly on this. The consequences of adoption for good and for bad are certainly ever present in me thinking through the speed with which I move forward on this. This hesitation for me is really shaped by the recognition that Gen AI is not only a methodological question, but also a market-driven question. Silicon Valley logics, perhaps best captured in the mantra, move fast and break things, sit uneasily alongside some of my own commitments to care, responsibility, and consequence. So in the context of an AI hype cycle, I see little reason to rush, while at the same time remaining open. So I really remain committed to learning about these tools while centering that learning on an examination of their consequences. So with that, I'll turn to thinking about the current moment we're living and how a reflexivity framework might offer guidance in making methodological decisions. So as we all know, it was November 2022 when ChatGPT was released and then became quite widely, readily, and excitedly available to the public. Many researchers quickly moved to herald its potential in supporting research activities, with some arguing for caution. So there's certainly been a balanced discourse around this to some extent. Many scholars pointed out how Gen AI has the capacity, as I noted, to increase the speed at which research is produced, as well as to expand the ways in which research studies are potentially designed or even carried out. Within the qualitative research community, Gen AI, and this is inclusive of ChatGPT, really quite quickly became widely positioned as useful and perhaps as DPOLE noted, inevitable. Alongside this inevitability, really has come growing promises of consistency between Gen AI and what it can do and what human qualitative researchers might produce. Many qualitative data analysis software platforms have also developed and integrated AI tools that they have suggested, and I quote them here, I quote, automatically uncover patterns, that's from MaxQDA, or I quote, provide fast and accurate insights, that's from Atlas TI. Proponents of using AI when engaging in qualitative inquiry have really pointed out that AI will not only reduce the amount of time required to engage in a research practice, that is qualitative inquiry, that it's often characterized, one as time intensive, but it's also, some would argue, going to allow us to be, as I'll quote Parker here, on the cutting edge of emerging technologies. So even before ChatGPT was launched, proponents of large language models such as R, David Parker and colleagues pointed to how Gen AI might allow for qualitative researchers to live, be, and work at the cutting edge. They wrote, Gen AI and large language models are becoming the norm for analyzing large complex data As these tools require human intervention and interaction, qualitative researchers are natural partners to maximize context. The benefits to qualitative researchers is the significant cost and time savings, as well as being on the cutting edge of emerging technology, which is revolutionizing many fields. I most certainly agree that Gen AI may very well create incredible opportunities for us as inquirers to engage with large data sets and really be at the methodological table of working with and analyzing big data. Indeed, we may now be able to think with tools such as ChatGPT and many, many others to support our early inquiry with our data. Perhaps we can now begin to more efficiently search for patterns while recognizing, of course, that efficiency isn't necessarily a goal or commitment for all of us. And we may now even be able to code and categorize our qualitative data in ways we had not imagined without partnering with some form of an AI tool. Alongside this, I also wonder what the cost might be for being at the cutting edge, an edge that could very well push us to forget to look backward, rather sitting, potentially even teetering at the horizon where the present and the futures meet. So I ask us as a community, what are the seen and unseen consequences to being at this cutting edge? As Fielding and Lee reminded the qualitative community well over a decade ago, new technologies come with strings attached. Specifically, they reminded us that new digital technologies comes with strings attached in the form of research policies, institutional expectations, and shifting boundaries around customary norms of what is and is not legitimate qualitative research. So what are the strings that come with being at the cutting edge? What boundaries are shifting around what is and is not legitimate in qualitative research? And thinking with these questions, particularly as related to Gen AI, I've begun to think with a reflexivity framework, a framework that I believe can help us engage with technological reflexivity, a practice that is an invitation to consider both the positive and negative, the pros, the cons, the intended and unintended consequences of inviting Gen AI to collaborate with us as qualitative inquirers. So while reflexivity is a concept that is widely written about, conceptualized and known to qualitative methodologists and researchers, there has been far less work focused on the technological choices and their impacts on inquiry processes. Whitaker and Atkinson in 2022 wrote that reflexivity is too often framed as a virtuous stance used by researchers to signal attainment of some level of rigor. However, whether we signal it or not, who we are, where we are, and the choices we make are, of course, always already impacting our research designs and the outcomes of our research. So reflexivity then perhaps can simply be conceptualized as the process of intentionally attending to the perspectives, the assumptions, even the attitudes and beliefs that shape design decisions and meaning making, world making, including the use of technology. The framework that I share here aims to articulate how technological consequences should be and already are a part of engaging in methodological reflexivity. So in this framework, my colleague Trina Paulus and I propose 4 categories in which to consider the consequences of engaging with technologies of all kinds in qualitative research workflows. Today, I focus on thinking about these 4 categories specifically in relationship to using Gen AI in qualitative research designs and practices. We propose 4 guiding questions to support reflexivity that's positioned across these 4 categories of methods, technology, humans, and knowledge outcomes. Well, the broader framework, we consider these questions more generally related to technologies and qualitative research. I've adapted them here to consider more closely how we might think about AI technologies across these 4 categories. So question 1, in what ways might existing methodologies and methods need to be adapted when using Gen AI in a qualitative research workflow? Question 2, In what ways might existing AI technologies need to be redesigned or adapted in a way that makes ethical and trustworthy qualitative research possible? Question 3, what are the potential consequences that humans, both researchers and participants, might experience as they enact a research workflow that includes Gen AI? And how will Gen AI impact the types of knowledge we can produce? So Gen AI has most certainly afforded new ways to think about doing qualitative research, most often as I've noted, speedy and more efficient. For some qualitative researchers, AI is described as being a think partner or assistant. And the strengths of Gen AI as a brainstorming companion and assistant seem plausible. And many have illustrated what that might look like. And alongside this, there have been also some growing questions as to how this AI assistant will change or make obsolete the human research role. We might also reimagine how we engage with large data sets, how we think about analysis, how we go beyond coding. Yet some have noted that we need more transparency around the large language models to be able to make sense of those questions. But indeed, many qualitative inquirers have been writing about and illustrating how AI at the moment is a potential collaborator, a co-author, a co-researcher, an assistant. There's lots of different framings that have been offered thus far. So as we look toward the future, I do think it's fair for us to wonder what it might mean for the role of a human researcher to be redefined or partially even replaced. Or to work in a different way within a different technological ecosystem. I've been wondering, what is one to make of qualitative inquiry if the human researcher is no longer a primary instrument or is reconfigured? A key question here as we consider consequences for technological design is also, in what ways might existing AI technologies need to be redesigned or adapted in a way that makes ethical and trustworthy qualitative research possible? Gen AI has impacted qualitative data analysis technologies in a range of ways. As one example, Gen AI is now integrated, as I noted, into many of the existing qualitative data analysis software packages. Many qualitative inquirers have begun to use various Gen AI tools such as ChatGPT. There are really a proliferation of Gen AI platforms available to us that can shape and infuse various considerations related to analysis. They often attend to pattern understandings of our data. In addition, I think all of us know that nearly every month, new powerful tools hit the market that indeed many would suggest could support qualitative analysis in some way. And there's no limit to this, of course. More is coming to the market monthly. This is most certainly exciting to many and potentially holds incredible promise. Yet still, even here, critical appraisal is really important. Particularly as we think about any turn in methodological traditions. A thoughtful vigilance is indeed needed when assessing the outcomes and consequences of the use of Gen AI. Currently, some have argued that there's far too little transparency around the nature of the algorithms, as well as the data security levels, and whether or not the data uploaded to AI-assisted platforms being used for large language model training is disclosed. Many platforms that have been initially developed for qualitative researchers do seem to be carefully considering these consequences as they choose when and how to integrate Gen AI, yet we must be vigilant. We must continue to ask these questions. A key part of technological reflexivity really must be for us to speak back to developers of these new tools. We must be ever reminded of what the Algorithmic Justice League has documented over time and consistently to how AI systems, and I quote them here, can perpetuate racism, sexism, ableism, and other harmful forms of discrimination. There is no escape from this reality. It is well documented. Specifically, Joy Bulawani and others within the Algorithmic Justice League have noted that and reminded us that this is in today's world that these AI systems are used to decide who gets hired. We know that the quality of medical treatment received is also impacted, and whether we become a suspect in a police investigation. They go on to say that while these tools show great promise, they also can harm vulnerable and marginalized people and threaten civil rights. So unchecked, unregulated, and at times unwanted, AI systems can amplify racism, sexism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination. And I would suggest this is not something we can find a way out of, we don't escape, but rather we must engage in these realities as we critically appraise what it means to do qualitative inquiry in an AI-laden world. There are, of course, many consequences to human relationships when we think about the use of Gen AI in qualitative inquiry, and I just offer a few here. And there, of course, are many that we could generate in the question and answer period as well. So first, and this is one that certainly has been across the literature, but most predominantly in popular press, it has become increasingly acknowledged that AI is most certainly not environmentally neutral. Therefore, when we're thinking about our use of it as qualitative inquirers, it really does compel us to engage in critical appraisal. A question that I think with around this is, what methodological footprint are we leaving? I wonder this question, drawing upon the work of my colleagues, Mirka Koro and Jenny Wilgemuth and Ethan Trin, who ask us to think about methodological footprints. The evidence for me is quite clear on this, that alongside the proliferation of data centers that house AI servers, we know that comes the production of electronic waste. The developers of large language models certainly are building vast stockpiles, some would say, of unethically scraped or more recently purchased data. These are stored in data lakes and warehouses that certainly have serious and sometimes hidden costs. Energy demands are needed, for instance, to keep the servers cool. These are realities. So importantly, technology reflexivity demands that we not simply flatten or even simplify how we make sense of the consequences of our use of Gen AI and qualitative research. So as I think about my own use, both in my everyday life and as I imagine what might I adopt in methodological practice, I also am thinking with the writing of University of Maryland Information Studies professor Katie Shilton, who noted that Gen AI tools are trained on text and images that were created through significant human effort and creativity. After that training, workers, many of them poorly paid, are contracted to flag obscene and hateful content to make these systems safe for work and for classrooms. Class activities, in contrast, prioritize students doing their own work, benefiting from unpaid and poorly paid labor and many other people to complete class assignments is ethically fraught. She goes on to write, if you're using these tools to make your life easier, it's worth thinking about whose lives they made harder. So what are our methodological footprints? In deciding to engage with AI, what footprint will our research projects leave? Is it possible to reduce our methodological footprints when engaging with Gen AI? Some would argue it is possible and invite us to learn how to do this. As Assistant Director General for Communication and Information at UNESCO recently noted, and I'll quote them here, Gen AI's annual energy footprint is already equivalent to that of a low-income country, and it is growing exponentially. To make AI sustainable, he wrote, we need a paradigm shift in how we use it, and we must educate consumers about what they can do to reduce their environmental impact. In alignment with this call, UNESCO and UCL recently put out a report showing that small changes to how large language models are built and used can dramatically reduce energy consumption without compromising performance. So indeed, there are pathways available to one to consider. As has always been true of the digital world and its intersection with qualitative inquiry, there's not a single right way to put Gen AI to use within qualitative inquiry. Some literature has begun to highlight AI-assisted qualitative research workflows and how they can support us in acquiring a bird's eye view of data, allowing us to have a first pass of the data. And some would suggest you could envision using Gen AI at the conclusion of your analysis, perhaps to see what you maybe missed or could see in a different way. Others have forwarded the notion of a refusal, so refusing its use, and that is also a pathway forward. The discourses surrounding the use of Gen AI for qualitative inquiry has very much centered Gen AI as one that might support us in ridding of the parts of the qualitative research process that perhaps we find boring or tedious or too labor intensive. Yet perhaps the process is the product. So here again, we need to engage in critical appraisal. So using Gen AI in qualitative analysis may indeed be useful. It may be a thoughtful choice. It may be helpful. Gen AI has most certainly afforded new ways to think about doing qualitative research. Some have written about it as allowing us to be more speedy, more efficient, and in many cases have a clear focus on the practice of identifying patterns. There is certainly potentiality here to reimagine how we engage with big data and integrate other qualitative approaches, particularly beyond coding. Yet I would suggest that AI affords an increase in certain kinds of methodological productivity. One, I argue, that tends to emphasize, right now at least, Western instrumentalism and efficiency. And I think it's important for us to ask, where might this leave us? What might become of the possibilities of a slow ontology, that is, an ontology that really prioritizes deep human knowing rather than speed and high outputs and efficiency? And I do wonder here, might Gen AI be a space where we can also think with this question of slow ontology? Moreover, we cannot be certain that AI-generated prompts are necessarily always accurate, nor that the training data used to train models are bias-free. We know that training data are being scraped from everywhere that surrounds us, and at times without permission, with many models lacking transparency. As my colleague Daniel Turner wrote, who's the developer of the Quirkos software, one thing that these models almost certainly weren't trained on is qualitative research. And of course, this may be changing as we speak. Nonetheless, which almost never has publicly available participant data or coding frameworks that these tools could learn from. So while we can't know for sure that data was used to train ChatGPT, we can be fairly sure that it does not include much qualitative data and contains inherent bias. So this is an important thing for us to also be considering as we think about our own role in this conversation. So where does this leave us? I think it leaves us really with an invitation to engage in critical appraisal, and in some doing, commit to technological reflexivity, engaging with key questions really as we decide to take up or not to take up Gen AI in carrying out our qualitative research. And as we do this, I do think we need to be asking these questions. What are the ways that existing methodologies and methods might need to be adapted when using Gen AI in a qualitative researcher? We can ask, in what ways might existing AI technologies need to be redesigned or adapted in a way that makes ethical and trustworthy qualitative research possible? What are the possible consequences that humans, both researchers and participants, might experience as they enact a research workflow that includes Gen AI? How will Gen AI impact the types of knowledge we can produce? So as I think with these questions, I want to share a bit of where I'm sitting with these questions today. So in her recent book, Empire of AI, Karen Howell wrote, "What I reject is the dangerous notion that broad benefits from AI can only be derived from, and indeed will only emerge from, a vision for the technology that requires the complete capitalization of our privacy, our agency, and our worth." She goes on to say that models can be small and task specific, their training data contained and knowable, ridding the incentives for widespread exploitative and psychologically harmful labor practices and the all-consuming extractivism of producing and running massive supercomputers. She further notes that the creation of AI can be community-driven, consensual, respectful of local context and history. Its application can uplift and strengthen marginalized communities. Its governance can be inclusive and democratic. And she goes on to offer multiple examples of how this is happening in local, small ways at a global scale. So I want to lean into the wisdom to bring us to a close in my talk today of my colleague Julianne Cheek, who in a forthcoming opening to a special issue on the intersection of AI and health and qualitative research, wrote the following. She said, "We must insert ourselves into conversations about and plans for these developments," referring to AI. "We must do so proactively, not reactively, asserting, not defending, and looking forward rather than just backwards. This is not selling qualitative inquiry out to AI, far from it. Rather, it is engaging with AI, but on our terms." She then goes on to remind us what Norm Denzin wrote in 2009, which was that scholars have an obligation to write their way into historical moments. The failure to do so makes us complicit with the histories that too often go on behind our backs. So my hope today is that we can rest with that reminder that this is our opportunity to write our way to knowing, to make our way to knowing, and that we can do it as a community with care and thoughtfulness as traditions are potentially turned. So with that, I'll open it up to inviting your thoughts, your questions, your comments, your curiosities. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was just really stimulating and gave us a lot to chew on, which is wonderful. I will invite all of our participants to take a moment to put your question in the Q&A, which is open, and we'll keep checking that for questions. You can also unmute and ask your question as well. So please go ahead and prepare those. And while we're waiting for that, Jessica, I'll just maybe start with a question that I think you ended beautifully as a segue to, and Denzin's point about, we have to kind of, make sure we're writing our ways into history here and not just sitting alongside it. At the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, which I direct here at the University of Alberta, we had a couple sessions this year on AI and qual research. And one of the key takeaways from both was the importance of literacy about large language models. And you've given us some good critical material around the biases, around how it can shape what we know and how we know, et cetera, but also just knowing how it works as best we can, and where it comes from. So I wonder if you want to comment on that, because it seems to me that the sense of inevitability and omnipresence and omniscience around AI is driven in part by this kind of sense of overwhelmingness instead of situating it and putting it in its place, right? Because it is specific and it has bounds to it, and is made in particular ways. So just if you might comment on the literacy aspect for reflexivity.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, Sarah. And I think I have a couple of thoughts on that. First, I think we could look back to kind of the histories of technologies and qualitative inquiry, and we have scholarship that has traced how there were a range of orientations and positions to the emergence of qualitative data analysis software, and that, of course, was a significant debate for decades within the field of qualitative inquiry. And one of the threads of thinking within that scholarship is the idea that to debate, we need to be familiar with the very thing we're debating. Similar to, I know I often will say in the courses I teach of when we come in to learn a methodology, we're often trained really, really well to critique, but the first step is actually to know, so that our critiques are situated within that knowing. So I feel similarly about Gen AI, that we can throw everything out the door, and understandably so. The concerns have been certainly highlighted both in scholarship and popular press. But one of the things we might be missing if we don't engage in careful study of Gen AI and work alongside folks in fields that are deeply enmeshed in developing the tools that are becoming present for us, is that our critiques are going to be based in popularized notions of AI versus knowing. So for instance, I'm particularly interested in the growing body of scholarship that's pointing to small models, small ways of thinking about AI, and the ways that folks are actually leveraging creative, community-oriented AI tools that are specific to a given situation, and those particular small large language models are also ones that have very different impacts on the environment and very different impacts on humans, and also very different understandings of what counts as the data. So all that to say, I think literacy around these things is one of the most kind of first important steps that needs to be made in order for us to situate our critical decisions on adoption or not adoption in a sense of what it is that we're critiquing and what it is we're actually choosing to adopt or not to adopt, and recognizing that there's lots of different pathways forward, not just the ones that are the most popularized within even the methodological community.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so much to chew on. A couple of notes of real thanks for a thought-provoking presentation in the chat. And then we have a question from Costa Antonio Pedro, who asks, by resisting the idea of the inevitability of AI in qual research, how do you imagine researchers can, in practice, say no to the use of AI in institutional contexts that are increasingly driven by the great gods of efficiency, automation, and productivity, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one that we're all thinking with, not just as qualitative inquirers, but the institutions that we work in have, of course, adopted all of these discourses as well. And very much this is experience, I think perhaps all of us have the experience of it being pushed down on us to be more efficient. So here's a question that I ask around this. I really do wonder, because quite often technologies are offered as a mechanism to help us do something better, or to fix something that's been broken. When I think about my own methodological practice, a core question that I ask when thinking about do I have to adopt X, Y, and Z is there something I need to fix? Is there something that's not going well? Is there something that could be pursued in a more thoughtful, methodologically grounded way? And I'm personally uncertain that simple adoption for the notion of efficiency is going to make me more efficient. I feel this across kind of my life as well of is that really going to benefit me from an efficiency perspective? Does it really help us do things better? That's certainly what we're being told. I mean, and I would argue that that's kind of big tech discourse, because we need to believe that in order to invest, and this is all market driven. So we need to believe that in order for us to invest in those things. And we, of course, know that methodological practice has always intersected with markets as well. So we need to be aware of, like, where is that message coming from? So I say all that to say is I don't feel like I don't feel like it's a selling point for someone to tell me that this will allow me to be more efficient. I'm particularly interested in quality grounded qualitative inquiry. And so, in thinking about adoption of AI, that's kind of a more foregrounded question for me is, does this afford us the opportunity to do work that we as a community recognize as producing some kind of sense making, some kind of quality that perhaps wasn't possible otherwise? Um, I would argue that efficiency raises a whole set of questions for us as a methodological community about how we come to know. Um, Efficiency, yes, is something is certainly part of the worlds that we're navigating. There's been lots of writing around kind of the neoliberal universities and academic contexts. But if we're thinking about it from a methodological perspective, I think we have to intersect that with what are the implications for methodological practice, what are the implications for quality research, and what we can't come to name as a grounded set of practices. So can we really say no? For those that haven't read Javier Monteforte's article on refusal and qualitative inquiry, there are some folks that are saying yes, we can say no. Refusal is always right here. And so I think that part of critical appraisal and engaging in kind of a slow movement forward is us really making sense of what are we saying yes to as a methodological community, and how does that intersect with our commitments and our understanding of the foundations of qualitative inquiry. And I really don't think there's one answer here. I think it's for us to collectively deliberate and make sense of and look towards those consequences.
Yeah, thank you. That actually is your response there is a great segue to the next good question from Emma. Do you think there's a real risk of splitting the qualitative research community and causing a new sort of digital divide through non-use of AI in qual research? And could this have further consequences in our sense of support and community being eroded?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. We certainly have seen in the literature, the methodological literature related to AI, some very divergent orientations to the adoption of AI that could certainly support needing to ask this question. What might this mean to our community? This is one of those places where I do think it's useful to look backwards. We know that there was some very different orientations that have been taken up in relationship to qualitative data analysis software packages, and the debates in some cases are still intense, but AI has kind of overshadowed that at this stage. But within that context, we did see an opportunity within the methodological community to use those debates as an opportunity to unpack what connects us, like what resonates across these different perspectives that makes qualitative inquiry, qualitative inquiry. And so, yes, there are very divergent perspectives right now on the use of Gen AI, and that is an opportunity. It's within differences that we can often make sense of what resonates, what holds us together. And so, I have a colleague, Michelle O'Reilly, who often says in the methodological debates, we need to recognize that we need to let penguins be penguins and ducks be ducks, and we can all sit in the same table and recognize our differences while also recognizing that you're a duck, I'm a penguin, we're both animals. And in that metaphor, what is being pointed to is the idea that our divergent perspectives is really also an opportunity to make sense of similarities within our differences. So I think the answer is yes to your question, but it's on us to stay at the table together and find places of resonance. And I also think methodological development is often at its best when we have these tension points, because it does push us forward as a community to think within those tension points.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I couldn't agree more. There's a couple of comment and a question in the chat, and I'll just sort of summarize as best I can Daniel's point that we have to understand the the AI issues in relation to the pressures felt in the in our institutions around publishing and metrics, right, efficiency, et cetera. So it's a good point, Daniel. Thank you. I've also been thinking lately. I've been reading a book on students who are juggling work and education, and the author referred to Berlant's notion of cruel optimism as well. And so, how is it that
Hmm.
we are actually real about, right, these situations that students and the university are in without imposing ideals that will only make things harder? So yeah, I've been thinking
Hmm.
about that lately. And then Fabio's question: if AI reconfigures the relationships between researcher, participant, data, and interpretation, what types of ethical or epistemological losses do you consider most difficult to perceive, right? Therefore, most dangerous for qualitative research's commitment to situated and relational knowledge?
Hmm. That's a great question. And I think what makes this also a great question is in some ways we don't know, and that's also what makes it most dangerous is these are the unknown consequences. I know for me an area within um, engaging with the scholarship around AI, not from a qual inquiry perspective, but just more AI in general, that felt particularly important to foreground in my own decision making around how to make sense of AI and qualitative inquiry, does relate to the ways in which data workers become part of the technological ecosystem, as well as permissions around what kinds of data is used or not used. I think those are the kinds of queries that, because they're not really in our face, are often easiest for us to put in the background when we're sitting with our own data and having technological opportunities in front of us to engage with that data. What happened behind the scenes is I know for me often the thing that um, can be quickly put to the side. And I do think, given our commitments, our foundational commitments as a qualitative community, historically we've centered relational knowing. I think that's why it's fundamental for us to think about these consequences, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes us feel. These are fundamental commitments to our way of thinking about what it means to be a field of qualitative inquiry. So the relational components, the human impacts, um, and I would also argue the impacts between human and the environment are important for us to uh, be discomforted with as we make decisions on adoption, as well as we make decisions on how to learn about other ways to build AI tools and leverage AI tools in ways that are attentive to the relational consequences of its use. I would certainly welcome this question being a question that we all think together on. I think together we can really think through a thoughtful way to have your question, Fabio, be a central question that carries us forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've got a couple of minutes left. I don't see any other questions. I have one burning question that maybe is just too big, but wanted to put it out there, and that is when you talk about the relational, actor network theory or new materialism might, put technology, our relations with technology and technology as part of relationality, right? On the table. And I'm wondering if you think about it that way or no.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Yeah.
technology part of relationality, right? Do we have to
Yep.
always think of technology as in relationship with us?
Mm-hmm. So, yes, it's a big question, and I'll just try to answer it really quickly because I want to turn back. So, earlier and almost 20 years ago, in some early writing with my colleague Trina Paulus, we wrote about digital tools and qualitative inquiry, and we did take it up in a very instrumental way, um, and kind of oriented to it and wrote about it as here's some tools that we can use, and here are the tools that have been used, and here's how QDOS packages uh, might support your process. Um, and quickly after, we began to engage with a lot of the critical technology literature, also received feedback, critiques of that kind of simplifying, depolitical orientation to technology. And about 5 years later, shifted and wrote differently and engaged with new materialisms and critical technological studies to really center this idea that there is no neutral tool and that tools become part of the methodological ecosystem, like it is part of us working together. So really oriented to as a co-research part of that research process. And I personally resist the idea that we can just say, I've used AI as if it's a thing here. It becomes immediately embedded in my way of thinking, even. There's no escape from that. So, and I would say that's true of all digital tools and technologies. That is technology. We live and work and research through those tools. And so that also just reminds us of the importance of engaging in that technological reflexivity, because the consequences are with us, whether we acknowledge it or not, for good and for bad. There are great possibilities here as well.
Thank you so much for indulging my last question.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
thank you to you and to everyone for really good questions. And this has been a really engaging conversation. So thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you so much, Sarah, for facilitating the conversation. This was fun, everyone.